Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me first apologize for the weather, but we're not expecting precipitation, but I'm very grateful that we have this tent, so thank you all for coming out. I'm delighted that we're able, in the College of Liberal Arts, to do something to mark Earth Day. And we have a very short program, so that's good. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our three presenters, performers. Before I do that, I want to first of all thank the staff in the Dean's office for all their help. I want to thank our videographer and facilities and our IT people who have all this past year been doing tremendous amount of work. So thank you all again. This is going to be recorded as a video, and the good news is that therefore we're going to make it very widely available to all our internal constituencies and all our external stakeholders. So everybody will get, or as many people as possible will get to experience what I think will be three beautiful presentations. About 2 years ago, I was very lucky to be able to attend the annual composers concert of our own music faculty. And at that, I believe it was the debut of Professor Lori Dobbins's piece, 11th Hour, a cello piece, which Jacques Lee Wood played beautifully that evening. And so I'm really delighted that we're going to hear it again, because it's a tremendous piece. If you got the program, you can read the couple of sentences that Professor Dobbins wrote about it, but in case you haven't, I'll just take a minute to read those, quoting her. And again, it's called 11th Hour. Quote, "When I was in the 4th or 5th grade, I learned about various threats to the environment that could lead to catastrophe. I was fairly reassured when adults told me people were working hard every day to find solutions that would save our beautiful planet. 50 years later, the doomsday clock is set at 2 minutes before midnight, and the 11th hour is here." So Lori Dobbins produced this piece in 2019. And so again, thank you all for showing up. And now we get to enjoy this piece from Jacques Lee Wood, who's a resident cellist here in the Department of Music. He's a well-known cellist, has a very broad repertoire from early Baroque cello pieces to contemporary pieces, and also dabbles a little bit, I believe, in a bit of jazz and bluegrass. He maintains an extensive schedule of performances up and down the East Coast and in China, where a few years ago his album, which is part of a duo, right, String Lab, with his collaborator who's a guitarist, debuted their Paperworks pieces. So I encourage you, and I'm sure you'll want to after you hear him perform, to go on his website, and you'll get access to a lot of YouTube videos as well as to his own professional recordings. So thank you, Jacques Lee Wood, for being here today. Thank you so very much, Jacques. That was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Our clapping, the intensity is dampened by the cold, but we truly enjoy that. And thanks to Lori Dobbins again for composing that beautiful piece. Our second performer, presenter, is Professor Lawrence Hamilton from the Department of Sociology. So he brings a different perspective to understanding climate change and thinking about the 11th hour. Professor Hamilton has been studying issues of society, climate and geography and weather for many decades and has taught a very popular course here at UNH on Arctic society, based on his research in part studying the impact of climate change and weather patterns from places as far away as Alaska to Greenland, and then for the last several years, closer to home, doing national surveys, looking at people's attitudes towards climate change, global warming, and in particular focusing on how people's political affiliation and ideology tends to mediate their understanding of science and trust in scientists. So he's been studying these issues long before it became even a more urgent issue as it has over the last few years. So we're delighted that Larry is going to speak today about his many years of survey research and some of the take-home points. And I should point out that Larry is also excellent at data visualization, so he does beautiful graphs and PowerPoints, but today we're depriving him of those props, but I'm still very positive that we'll have a great presentation. Thank you, Larry.
And thank you, Dean Dillon. And if you are missing my, do I use this? Yeah. If you're missing my graphs and visual props, the Carsey School webpage today has a link to a published and expanded version of what I'm going to be talking about, and it has 2 graphs. A few weeks before Earth Day in 2010, political scientist David Moore and I met for some reason in the bagel shop in Durham with the intention of designing a timeless survey question about climate change. Here's what we came up with. Which of the following 3 statements do you think is more accurate? Climate change is not happening now. Climate change is happening now, but caused mainly by natural forces. Or climate change is happening now, caused mainly by human activities. That last choice intentionally corresponded to pretty closely, just a paraphrase of the position statements issued by just about every major scientific society on Earth. So by tracking what percentage of people agreed with that, with the scientific consensus, we intended to sort of take the pulse of US public opinion on climate change. Well, that question has been answered now by more than 46,000 people on about 60 surveys, ranging regional surveys from coastal Louisiana to Alaska, on nationwide surveys, including the gold standard General Social Survey, and importantly on about 46 surveys in New Hampshire, conducted roughly every 3 months since 2010. So what did we find? We did not find what we expected to see, which is big impacts from new scientific reports, political events, public opinion, or hurricanes, major disasters, that sort of thing. They had most made very minor blips in the timeline. What we did see is a very gradual rise, hence the title of my talk, from somewhere around half of the people agreeing with the scientific consensus to a little bit short of 2/3, and this occurring over a period of 11 years. There are 2 researchers at Duke University who published some studies recently demonstrating that people's opinions or the responses to survey questions mostly reflect settled dispositions, which remain the same over the individual's lifetime for most of those questions. And there's a relatively less common process of active updating where people change their opinions as they acquire new information. So many questions, there's no active updating, and on some there's a fairly small amount. Climate change is a high-profile topic in which new information is coming out almost every day. And I think that's why we see at least some evidence of active updating in that slow dawning of public opinion. But it's happening painfully slowly. The pace of the rise is dangerously slow compared to the pace of climate change itself. The researchers identified one group, however, for whom active updating of opinions is a little bit more common, and that is young adults. And indeed, if we break down our survey results by generation, we see that Generation Z, which is people born since 1997, that their acceptance of the scientific consensus on climate change was rising over this period at about twice the rate of any of the older generations. Now, that's hopeful in the long run as they become a larger fraction of the public, but generational replacement is a very slow process too. And practical steps toward more climate-aware policies could be hastened much faster than generational replacement by a substantial rise in voting participation. So there's potential for the slow dawn to speed up there if we see more voting towards climate-aware policies by young adults who are disproportionately, given their longer time horizons, disproportionately going to feel the effects of climate change. However, because of generational differences in views, legislation discouraging participation by young voters could have long-lasting consequences. For example, New Hampshire State Legislature is currently considering a number of bills that would make it more difficult for college students to vote. And the outcome of such efforts could shape the future in many ways. I'm sure you can all think of this, but from the most local issues to up to the scale of Earth's future climate. Thank you. I think I'll wrap up there.
So thank you, Larry. And I think people will have questions, and I'm sure you'll get some answers to those questions if you look at the Carsey brief tomorrow, or later today, in fact. But also, Larry's always very happy to follow up if you have any questions by email. But his research on this is highly quoted, not just in the academic journals, but really in the media. I haven't looked for a while, but I know he is one of these most cited of our researchers, not just at UNH, but nationwide in terms of media coverage of these findings, given the interest in climate change. So thanks again, Larry. And our third and coldest presenter probably is Professor Jaed Coffin from our English department. Professor Coffin is a prodigious writer. He teaches creative writing, fiction and nonfiction, and does a lot of podcasting and video casting and broadcasting. And he has already written 2 memoirs, including his highly acclaimed Rough House Friday. He writes also a lot of extensive essays for journals and magazines, and one of his topics of inquiry is on issues of climate change. And so we're delighted today, Professor Coffin is going to read one of his short pieces for us. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a piece that I haven't looked at for a while, but the piece was, I suppose, commissioned by the Portland Museum of Art. I was asked to go into the gallery and respond to a painting from their permanent collection. Actually, don't mind if I do. And the painting that captured my imagination is a piece by the artist Neil Welliver, and it's called Two Boys in a Canoe. The composition is just what it sounds like. 2 boys on a summer day standing in a river next to a green canoe. I think the image struck me because though I have, over time, developed more complex ideas about the human relationship to the environment, it's become very clear to me now as a father of 2 daughters that all of my affection for the natural world, in light of having traveled to wildernesses really around the world, it always began with my first and fundamental experiences in the semi-wilderness areas around the town where I grew up in Brunswick, Maine. And if we deprive our young of those seminal and primary experiences, then I think it will be more difficult to convince them that there's action that's necessary to take. So I'm going to read a piece called The Crooked River. I first discovered the crooked river during that mindless and wandering in-between period of late boyhood, when the dependency of childhood was behind me, when the ugly and overthinking self-awareness of my teenage years was still to come. Back then, I lived at home with my mother and sister, both of whom by then had lost interest in how I spent my long, shapeless days. I had a bike and several close friends in the neighborhood, and a general, if not vague, map in my head of the semi-wilderness that surrounded the town on the coast of Maine, where I've lived all but a few years of my life. On weekends, we met early, greased our gears with WD-40, filled up our water bottles, and set off into the territories, through downtown, along Main Street, down Water Street, scampering up a gravel slope to the railroad bridge, which we crossed illegally some 40 feet above the river, in plain sight of Route 1, in plain view of the old mills still yet to be resurrected, past cement forms spray-painted with pentagrams and swear words, the rocky railroad beds glittering brown and green with the glass of broken beer bottles. Then onto a series of dirt bike trails to the fairgrounds, racing along the demolition derby track until we hit the fine, buzzing sand of the power lines. A mile or so of steady riding, then a turn-off into the old quarries where giant goldfish swam in the dark water and a hermit had built a castle out of tarps and old cars, and then deeper into the woods until an old logging road descended into a shallow valley which murmured with the promise of ocean-bound waters. None of us knew this river's name. In fact, there was some discussion that we were the first ones to discover it. So we just came to call it the river. The water was brown, smelled like farts and eggs, but the general consensus was that because of its remoteness and lack of foam, and because it did not feed from waters south of the mills, the river was more pure than the polluted waters of the nearby Androscoggin. We quickly built a fire, roasted hot dogs to a crisp, and then we just sat there, too innocent to drink beers or smoke, too free from the gaze of our parents to concern ourselves with breaking any rules. I don't remember what we talked about. Sports, bikes, girls we wanted to date. Most likely, nothing of any consequence. In fall, the river held no current. When we returned there in the spring, the brown water moved like a long carpet, carrying with it all the debris from the previous winter. The current was swift, enough to drag the entire trunk of a bone-white tree, enough to drown a doe whose body we found lodged in the shallow water, one eye wide open, staring at the trees. I had a friend, a Navy kid named Sam, who was equally fearless and impulsive, who decided that we must build a raft and float it down the river. Why we should undertake such an adventure we did not discuss, but it was unanimously recognized that should the mission come at the expense of our lives, our families would understand. For the next few weeks, we designed the vessel, logs, lashed with ropes, and so forth. But one afternoon, when we had spent several hours dragging dead trees out of the thick woods, Sam spotted a very large pink object bobbing toward us, a slab of rigid styrofoam about the size of a kitchen table, likely someone's trash. Off we went. I don't know how far we got, further than we'd planned. Danger, we believed, was nearby. But as we floated, the banks rose above us like the walls of a canyon. Something in my sense of the world began to shift. Looking back, I realized that this was when I first began to feel on my skin, in my stomach, in my imagination, the emotion of setting off into the unparented, indifferent, unpredictable world of the unknown. For the rest of that summer, we returned to the river like a gang of explorers in search of a new world. We never once discussed the fact that where we were headed was likely not more than a few miles from downtown. At some point, we stopped trying to float down the river and began to follow it on foot down a series of deer trails and paths, which eventually turned out onto a major road. That was the end of something wonderful. The following summer, there were new unknowns. Our bicycles could be ridden to the houses of girls in our neighborhood whose parents were gone at work for hours on end. And then there was that strange, humming, dinging arrival of the internet. I can still remember the day that I tried to convince several of my buddies to go back into the woods into the quarries to float the river again, to sit by the fire and cook hot dogs and do nothing. But they were more interested in a game called Sim City, in which you created an entire civilization, housing developments, prisons, sewers, by pressing a series of buttons. Like so many of the semi-wild places I once knew, the valley of the upper Crooked River has been transformed into a housing development, replete with independent senior living, a golf course, an ecology center, and several miles of well-maintained walking trails. It is not difficult at all to access the river. In fact, a gravel path suited for a wheelchair will take you right to the very same rapids which Sam, not 20 years gone from Maine, ran on that piece of pink styrofoam. The river, it seems, has fallen under protection of a land trust, a relationship which is, I suppose, ultimately a good thing. In my backyard, I have a canoe, green, just like the one in the Neil Welliver painting. Like so many green canoes in so many backyards across Maine, it sits upturned on two semi-rotting wooden sawhorses. And several times a year, I take the canoe down a long dirt road under a highway bridge so that I can paddle down those familiar waters. From the water, I cannot see the houses in the new development. I can sometimes hear the bulldozers clearing more land. Sometimes I bring friends with me. Sometimes I go alone. I don't make fires, less because I am afraid of getting caught, more because I have lost touch with the leisurely art of messing around in the woods. Some things I see remain the same water, the same occasional deer carcass trapped between boulders, its bloated belly rising half visible above the surface. Nothing now is unknown to me about this area. It is precisely 4.3 miles to Route 24. I have studied the crooked finger of the river's journey on the Gazetteer several dozen times, but the feeling of not knowing, the feeling of discovery, is oddly robust in the face of what I know. No matter how many times I come to the end of the river, no matter how many times I drag my canoe out of the muddy waters at the end, a small part of my imagination still believes in the miracle of novelty. That one time I might just keep paddling forever, back in time to that period of my life when I, shirtless, aimless, uncaring, had little else on my mind. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Jed. That was beautiful. And so thank you all again. Thanks for coming out. I'm sorry about the weather again, but the sun is now shining. So that's good. And again, thank you to Professor Coffin, Professor Hamilton, and to Jacques Lee Wood, and to Lori Dobbins, who composed 11th Hour. So please keep warm, and I hope we can make this an annual event at the College of Liberal Arts, doing some little thing to mark Earth Day. So take care, everybody, and thank you very much. Bye-bye, and thank you.